Our next speaker, Chris Appy, is a professor of history, the director of the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy at UMass Amherst. Professor Appy will address how foreign policy can become more democratic and less imperialistic, or how it cannot become more democratic and less imperialistic until elite policymakers are challenged to relinquish their claims of American exceptionalism. Chris, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ryan, and to my co-panelists, and to everyone who set up this event, and those of you who are listening in. Yes, like Eric Ross, I'm at the University of Massachusetts, where I teach history. I've written 3 books about the US war in Vietnam. Now I'm working on a book about Daniel Ellsberg, the whistleblower who in 1971 turned over to the press and the public a 7,000-page secret history of the American war in Vietnam that came to be known as the Pentagon Papers, that revealed some 2 decades of government lies about that war. And I'm also directing this Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy. So I hope you will take a look at our website. Maybe Ryan or Eric can post it in the chat. It's eipad.org. You can find a lot of our events recorded there. You know, many important things have to change if we are to dismantle US militarism and imperialism and create a more democratic and peaceful foreign policy. Tonight, I want to focus on one thing that needs to be changed, and that is the most important of the ideological underpinnings of US imperialism, which I think is American exceptionalism. Unless and until that ideology is radically undermined, really at all levels of our society, I don't think we can have substantial change in our relations with the world. For whatever else policy makers, foreign policy elite will say to explain one war or another, or one war by proxy or another, the bottom line has forever been a key tenet of American exceptionalism, which is that, as in the words of George Bush, and he's not alone, we are the greatest force for good in the world, always on the side of democracy, self-determination, human rights, and that without us and our leadership, anarchy, chaos, tyranny, instability, all these horrible things would reign supreme. Or as our current Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is constantly saying, we are on the side of a rules-based international order, as if the United States has never broken any international laws, as if we had never invaded Iraq, never waged a war of aggression in Vietnam that cost 3 million lives, or you could go back to the 19th century in our war of aggression against Mexico, countless overthrows of sovereign governments, some of them democratically elected, as in Chile in 73, Guatemala in 54, Iran in 53, or some efforts that have tried but have been failed, as with our multiple efforts to overthrow Castro in Cuba. And yet, against all this evidence, faith in American exceptionalism continues. It's sort of a puzzle as to how widespread that faith is among the American public, but I think it is maybe more widespread than we often realize, which is kind of puzzling because in one way, I think Americans can be quite self-critical if you ask them questions about specific parts of our national life. I mean, what do you think of our public schools? It gets very low grades. What do you think of our healthcare system, our Congress, government in general, economic opportunities, our infrastructure? Americans can be very critical, but if you ask them, is the United States the greatest nation on earth? I think many people do still say yes. And I think given our record, that's a real problem. And within the foreign policy establishment, that faith is practically written into the job description, a condition of employment. And anybody from the inside who really challenges it seriously compromises their career. And I can't think of a major candidate for the president of the United States since World War II, with the possible exception of George McGovern, who's even hinted that we should not make it a top national priority, in the words of Kamala Harris, to be the strongest and most lethal, to have the strongest and most lethal armed forces in the world. Or think of that line uttered by Secretary of State Madeleine Albright in the Clinton years, a line she used to justify these brutal sanctions regime against Iraq. She described the United States as the indispensable nation. We stand taller, we see farther, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what does that mean? And what is the opposite of indispensable? Well, it's dispensable. And that, in effect, is sort of the way we regard the rest of the world. Think of it in personal terms. I mean, what parent would advise their child to go off to elementary school and say to them, now make sure you tell all your classmates that you are the most important, exceptional student in the class. That if you don't lead the class and tell people what to do, the whole class will fail. Well, that really is in effect how we operate in the world. And yet we actually have produced failing grades. We've lost every major war since World War II, and we failed to enrich democracy and human rights. Two of the principal claims of American exceptionalism. You might say that World War II was on the side of democracy and a just war, and there's something to that, but it has some serious asterisks. First of all, it required a massive contribution of the USSR, and it included the firebombing of some 67 Japanese cities, followed by the use of atomic weapons. So fully demonstrating that even just wars can be fought with unjust means. But as David Swanson and others have indicated, we are exceptional in some ways. We do spend more money on arms than the next 9 most militarized nations on Earth combined. We lose war after war, but as Norman Solomon has written, some entities in our country never lose. And think of the big 5 military contractors: Boeing, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon. We are also exceptional in the amount of arms we sell. As merchants of death, we account for 40% of that market. We are also, as David Vine has taught us, exceptional in the number of military bases we have on foreign soil, some 800, whereas no other nation has more than a dozen or so. We are also exceptional in the number of our military interventions around the world. And each year we conduct military operations, including military training exercises, in roughly 2/3 of the world's countries. And also all of these exceptional qualities, all these exceptional manifestations of US imperialism fundamentally undermine our claims that the meaning of American exceptionalism is about promotion of democracy and self-determination. What do we do? Well, education is a part of it. We certainly have to challenge these ideological claims. We do, of course, need to try to elect people who challenge them, and we'll try in, say, Congress to assert greater oversight of the foreign policy establishment elite that is by and large completely unelected and unaccountable. So bottom-up organizing is certainly crucial. But I think we also need to recognize, reach out to, and magnify the contributions of people who have worked from the inside, who have become dissenters and whistleblowers. Daniel Ellsberg is, of course, one of them. But as he would have said, if he died a year and a half ago or so, whistleblowers don't act in a vacuum. They are inspired by others, and they in turn inspire people. Ellsberg often said that he never would have released the Pentagon Papers in 1971 if he had not been inspired by others who risked arrest or were, in fact, imprisoned in their effort to stop the war, like some 3,200 young Americans who were imprisoned for resisting the draft, or people like the Berrigan brothers, activists in the civil rights movement, etc. So there are, the press pays scant or dismissive or even often very derisive attention, to the extent that they pay attention to whistleblowers at all. I'm thinking a lot recently of these Gaza whistleblowers. There are at least now 5 or 6 of them who have been completely ignored by the press. And on February 20th, the Ellsberg Initiative is going to have a webinar that includes 3 of these three U.S. officials who resigned in protest with quite eloquent letters of resignation, public letters of resignation in opposition to American complicity in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Briefly, just to mention their names, and you can find information and copies of their resignation letters pretty easily online. There's Harrison Mann, who was a U.S. Army major who worked for 3 years at the end of his 13 years of service with the Defense Intelligence Agency, felt incredible shame and guilt for his contribution to American foreign policy, and resigned in protest. Anel Sheline was a State Department official who resigned in March and wrote that as a representative of a government that is directly enabling the international, what the International Court of Justice had said could plausibly be a genocide in Gaza, such work has become impossible. And she also said, interestingly, in an interview on Democracy Now!, that many of her colleagues actually shared her views and were not yet themselves willing to resign, but encouraged her to speak out publicly and, in effect, to speak for them. And then a third that will be involved is a man named Alexander Smith, who was a lawyer in public, is a lawyer and public health expert working for USAID. He was a senior advisor on gender, maternal health, child health, and nutrition. And about a year ago, he put together a PowerPoint presentation on, no, not a full year ago, more like 7 months, on conditions of women and children, medical conditions in Gaza. And his supervisors first tried to censor parts of that report that they didn't like. Then they canceled his talk altogether. And finally, they said he had to either resign or face dismissal. And he quit in protest. So I think, if we're going to educate the public on these matters, putting these stories of these inside whistleblowers is an important step, and connecting that inside critique with this bottom-up grassroots organizing campaign that everyone has been talking about, and which I too support. So I will stop there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Professor Appy. I do have a couple questions for you. We'll start with the whistleblower stuff, because that's where you ended. Love Daniel Ellsberg, edited a film about him that you can see at diffusenuclearwar.org, about how he moved to just fighting against ICBMs and nuclear weapons. I love Daniel Ellsberg. When he was a whistleblower, or when he was whistleblowing, that's what the question is about. How much effect do you think these whistleblowers have? Are they one of our great tools for education and against militarism, or are their effects negligible and more just like cultural and like entertaining? Or are their effects real, and does it make change, or does it shift culture?
That's a huge topic, and there's a lot to say about that. I'd start by saying that in one way, whistleblowers are a sign of the weakness of our democracy, that we have to rely on people to expose lies and wrongdoing that would not otherwise be known to the public. The other thing to say is that whistleblowers would be more valuable to us if we paid attention to what the information they're disclosing, rather than debate their personalities and their integrity, or whether they were breaking the law or not. And so we as we do in America, often focus on the individual over the larger issues. But yes, I do think whistleblowers serve the public interest, can serve democracy, can serve accountability, we need to reach out to them, make connections with them, and amplify what the messages they have to share.
Right. And to your point, yeah, Assange, not a government whistleblower necessarily, but we find out what the government's doing through him, murdering people in Iraq, I think the famous video was. And the media to this day doesn't mention what it was that he exposed, yes, only that he put
I should American say too,
lives at risk.
The legal repression against whistleblowers has only gotten far worse in the decades since Ellsberg. Ellsberg was the first American criminally indicted and tried for under the Espionage Act for releasing to the press and public privileged information, not to a foreign agent or country. And in the 21st century, particularly under Obama, as it turns out, many others have not only been indicted, but done serious time, like Chelsea Manning and Daniel Hale, to name just two.
Yeah, we've worked with Thomas Drake and Jeffrey Sterling, and the
Yeah.
Espionage Act is not something you can really fight back against either. If you get, if they say you violated the Espionage Act, that's kind of
Yeah.
that. They don't even need to
It,
show
it
evidence.
needs to
So,
either be abolished or radically reformed. Yeah.
yeah, I 100% agree. Um, Thank you, Professor Appy. Much appreciated.